How to draft good disclosure, the in-house perspective. This is the second panel I've done on this topic recently with a group of in-house practitioners. The first panel was incredible. I definitely urge you to check that out. But this one is just as good. The panelists were awesome. You're about to find out. Alex Shukhman is Director of Stockholder Interaction and Governance at Intel Corporation. Jennifer Card, who's a Director, Assistant General Counsel of Corporate and Secretaries at Etsy, and Henrique Canarim, VP, Senior Assistant, General Counsel, Assistant Corporate Secretary at Leidos. I'm Brock Romanek, today on RealTransparentDisclosure.com. Hi, it's Brock Romanek, How to Draft Good Disclosure, the in-house perspective. I'm so excited to have our guest today. And we're going to start right off with Alex talking about when you're working on brand new disclosure, some new development or a new rule requirement, what is your recommended process for starting? Do you use bullet outlines, review peer disclosures? How do you go about that, Alex?
Thank you, Brock, and it's a pleasure to be here with the esteemed other folks who are speaking as well. So thank you for giving me a chance to provide my thoughts. First thing that we try to do is, or at least that I try to do, is I try to look at who's driving the development. Is it a regulatory body? Is it a stockholder or a proxy advisory firm, right? Because those may have different perspectives. What we try to do is review the guidance that is on the topic. So it could be, whatever it is. We try to create a list of what are the key components, the disclosure points, and as you say, that typically will manifest itself into some kind of a bulleted outline. We will look at what are the facts or the actions that are necessary in order to support such disclosure, pull any relevant associated samples of disclosure or any kind of information that might be on the topic. We will consider the other stakeholders, right, who might be impacted, whether that's internally, the board, other committees. We will try to typically prepare a RACI chart, or who's responsible, accountable, who's consulted, and who's informed party on the matter. Leverage any of our advisors to assist with guidance, and whether that be counsel, proxy solicitor, any others. And then we will work on, obviously, architecting and building out the disclosure.
Yeah, you mentioned RACI chart. I've been hearing that more and more, so I think that's becoming a more common practice, but I'm not sure it's widespread. But from what I hear, it's, when I practiced in-house, I did not use one, but I'm not sure it was around back then. It's 25 years ago. And that's not complicated to do, right?
No, it's really easy. You just basically, like, you would have your checklist, and what you would do is, instead of just identifying each individual who has the task to do, because we're now operating with larger organizations with a lot of parties who might have different roles, you make it clear for everybody what is specifically their role, right? Are they responsible for it? Are they accountable? It helps ensure the fact that the right parties are the ones who are making decisions or whom you may need to inform. Because otherwise, if you don't do that, sometimes what will happen is it can just become very paralyzing and can slow you down. I don't know if the other folks on my colleagues here have similar experiences, but I have never found it to be too challenging.
And Jennifer, what is your process?
Hey, Brock. First, thanks for having me here. I'm glad to be here with you in the panel. We follow a lot of the same processes, and I also really like the idea of having a RACI chart. I think that really sets clear accountability. Where we would first start is determining what's driving the new disclosure. If it's a rule development, first and foremost, understanding what it is that the rule requires. The adopting release is a great place to start by reading the actual rule. I often turn also to the SEC's fact sheet or various other law firm memos for summaries. And understanding what the effective date is. Is this something that needs to happen immediately for a company, or is there some lead time to come into compliance with the disclosure requirements? I find creating a working draft is a great way to start. Creating an outline, creating bullet points, sketching out actual disclosures. We may look to other examples from early filers, or benchmarking with outside counsel or other companies to see how extensive disclosure may be in response to a new requirement. Another point to keep in mind, and this often goes to the RACI, chart that was mentioned is remembering that it's not only important to draft disclosure that's responsive to the rules, but also to be able to explain that to others that you might be working with as internal stakeholders. And that's often as important, if not more, than what the actual disclosure might be. Other developments that we could consider are how commonly are other companies implementing new disclosures? Is this something that's emerging practices or common practices? And considering different alternatives, we might have a narrative option 1 or 2, a graphic option 1 or 2, and show those for consideration. Consulting with others is also a really important part of our disclosure process. So not only legal working through the actual language, but if you're in-house, you likely need to share your new draft disclosure with your accounting team, investor relations, communications, and subject matter experts, for example, as well as your disclosure committee and possibly your board level committees. And so to this point, it's really important to have solid timelines. And if you plan to be creating new or different disclosure, making a project plan that's responsive to those timelines and deadlines.
Thank you, Jennifer. What about you, Enrique?
Yeah, this all resonates with me, and thank you, Brock, for the opportunity to being here. I'm very excited about it. I don't know that I have too much more to add from what was already said, but I would just like to emphasize what Jennifer mentioned on starting early, as it's really important. You know, oftentimes you are not going to be able to develop something or have this thoughtful process if you are just bundling it with a general proxy preparation process or a disclosure process. And if you're able to call out or separate the new items that you're going to be creating early, you might be able to start with a draft and have that reviewed on its own rather than with the rest of the disclosures. I think we had a recent example of that with the pay versus performance disclosures that were included in proxy statements very recently. There wasn't a whole lot of guidance available when the rule became effective, and we had to really look to, at least in our case, was probably one of the first things we started to look at, making sure that the folks that were crunching the numbers understood what was required, that we also were able to build the right internal controls over that information to ensure that the disclosure was in really solid shape. And leveraging advisors. You know, a lot of times your outside counsel will be advising dozens and dozens of other companies on the same requirements. And you might have other folks in the same position that are willing to do that. In that particular case that I also want to call out, you know, we wanted to educate our board very early. So we were lucky enough to be able to have a conversation with our compensation committee on those requirements, even to educate them and even to mock what that disclosure would have looked like. So when we had to put the proxy in front of them, the CDNA in front of them, they weren't surprised and understood really what that was intended to do and what was the rationale behind the SEC's rulemaking and so on. And then I also think we need to acknowledge that you might not get things absolutely right 100% the very first time. So being open-minded about evolving your disclosures after you insert a new element, whatever that is, and keep benchmarking what you're doing against others that you care about and refine that, really making an iterative process. And over time, you're making it better and better and more aligned with market practice and best practices overall.
Yeah, disclosure is never done until you hit that submit button. I can't agree with you more, Enrique. Jennifer, let's talk about peer disclosure. What types of peers are you looking at and how many typically?
Great question, Brock. So we would typically look at peer company disclosure when creating new disclosure. The compensation peer group can be a great starting point, as well as comparable companies in your company's industry. And there are also a lot of external resources. The Transparency blog, for example, highlights a number of companies that have good disclosure. I find that 4 to 5 good examples can be sufficient. There are times when you might need more than that if you're conducting a very comprehensive review. But that said, it's important to choose carefully. So I often think about what the other companies are in my own industry that are known for having good disclosure and using those as models. Another practice point is to consider where your own executive officers or directors may serve on boards of other companies. That can be great as a frame of reference, at least to keep in mind and consider as you're working through your drafting process.
And Enrique?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I really like to focus on, user friendliness of disclosures and making sure that information is easy to find. There's tons of resources out there, as Jennifer said, where you can find data in an easy to look at format. So companies like Labrador and others have guides, and books that are already compiled, where they call out good practices and good examples, and that makes the research process that much more efficient. And obviously, I look at my industry peers, but also outside. I particularly like to look at a couple of very large companies, and I think their disclosures are very scrutinized. So I believe that they're more likely than not to incorporate lessons learned over time, even when they're not directly within my peer group, just to see what they're doing. And I think that strategic approach of trying to look at yourself, but also looking at a couple of folks outside helps with transparency. And just making sure that you are not too focused only on the couple of companies that you mentioned that are your compensation peers or competitors that are in your 10K. And then the last thing I would note in terms of benchmarking is really going back to making sure that whenever you're adding a disclosure based on something that you're looking at from someone else, is really building the internal controls and making sure that you're going to be able to repeat that disclosure year over year. So do you really have the right folks bought in and understanding what is it that they're looking at outside? What is it that other folks are doing? And are we able to replicate that in a way that is consistent and that we can have a good story to tell year over year? So not just copying what else is out there, but making sure that it's tailored and that it's appropriate for your own circumstances.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And when you're looking at good samples disclosures of companies outside your industry, I think it's smart to look at companies that don't have the same fiscal year end to get it because they might be further along in the year. And so a company like Intel, which is not a 1231 company, is a good example of a company that typically has good disclosure and is sort of off the same fiscal year path that your own company is on. Alex, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think you're spot on, Brock. This question of benchmarking kind of reminds me of my teenager. Nobody wants to stand out; they want to just fit in. So you want to be part of the cool group. I think obviously anyone in this practice really wants to make sure you have a sense of a pulse of what everybody else is doing, right? And different companies have different philosophies. I think you have to be very mindful of. I've been at a few. And my current one, we try to be on the more transparent, if not the most transparent perspective on that. And you have to be mindful when you're looking at other companies, where do you slot in? Because the culture may not be one where they're wanting or feel comfortable necessarily being at the forefront of all of that, right? And so if you're looking at the benchmarking, we do it exactly as Jennifer and Enrique have mentioned. We look at the comp committee peer group. For us, it's anywhere between 15, 20 typically. The board member affiliations are critical to us because we don't want to be surprised when we're throwing this stuff up to our board members, whether it's in a committee at the board level. You want to know, well, how are they dealing with these issues at their other companies? Because the last thing you really want to do is you're proposing something and then at all the other companies, they're doing something completely differently, right? So you need to just be mindful of what they're doing. We will look at gold standard companies as well. I think, for us, there's probably about 5 to 10 that I'm constantly, I've got copies of their proxy statements or their 10Ks or whatever it is. And they're in industry, they're broader industry, and they're completely out of the industry. And I think it's critical that you have a little bit of all of those things. So that way you can see, because sometimes the industry people will kind of it's a little like, you don't know anything better, right? And it's helpful to kind of see how someone else does it. And then lastly, I think what is helpful is, I think was mentioned, is issue specific. Sometimes disclosures can be helpful to look at specific places. I know, like what was mentioned, Labrador does a nice job, the transparency models, there are awards that are taken. There's also the Center for Audit, I think is it Quality, that puts out a very specific, detailed kind of composition of here's what, all the various things, and here are sample disclosures as well. So we'll look to those as well to assist when we help kind of figure out where we stand and whether we want to do certain disclosure.
Yeah, I just blogged about the CAQ's recent study of audit committee disclosures. It is very well received, and that was a very popular blog. I know we don't check stats, but lately I have been on which blogs are most popular, and it's sometimes it's pretty curious. Enrique, when you're updating a section of disclosure, what are you looking for to change, and how much diligence is involved typically?
Yeah, that's a really important question. I think a lot of this is making sure. I don't. This a lot of folks say that, but there's no longer a proxy season or a disclosure season. I think it's become the end of one season merges with the beginning of the next one. So we usually have some we call summer projects here, given that we're a 1231 company. So we usually try to get information from our key stakeholders. I think we'll really take a deep dive on proxy advisory firm reports, the ISS, Glass Lewis, and others, see what kind of feedback came there and what is it that we can do to incorporate the items that are being called out on from those folks. Also, we work very closely with our investor relations team. We do shareholder engagement sessions twice a year, once in the fall and once in the spring. And I'm fortunate enough to be able to sit in those meetings, and shareholders will, if you tell them what are you looking for, what is it that you expect to see, or what is it that we can do better or different, they will tell you very clearly what they expect. So we take that feedback very seriously. And to the extent that we can, we try to incorporate as much as possible. Obviously, as I said, ensuring that you have the right controls and that management is comfortable and that we're doing it in a thoughtful way. But it's a huge it's a very wealthy source of information there. So these are just a couple so the benchmarking, shareholders, proxy advisory firms, these are just some of the starting points that we take into account when we're doing the proxy. And obviously, things that change throughout the year when we need to craft something new because a program has changed or something needs to be refreshed. But I think that's a really strong way to start off, the summer part of the proxy season.
Alex?
Yeah, I would agree with, a lot of the thoughts that were just expressed. I would say also, in addition to, relying on your stakeholders are critical. I can't underscore that point enough. I found being in on those calls and hearing the questions and hearing, where are they interested in, where are they challenging you, where they're complimenting you on, really can provide a great roadmap for you on what do you want to do. They'll even give you examples of disclosure that they find to be incredibly helpful, right? Or they view to be the gold standard. And so that is amazing. I think the thing that we do, in addition to doing all the outside diligence, is that we do internal diligence, right? We do work with the teams on the inside, and you really have to evaluate also the environment and the receptiveness when you're looking to make change. It's a critical component in a large organization. Changes are often most well received under one of two scenarios. Either they're clear skies, like summertime, you don't have any problems, you're doing incredibly well, and everybody thinks it's nice to kind of do all kinds of changes, or you're under the gun and you have a serious problem, right? And then everybody's willing to kind of make drastic changes. Those are the two times. If you're short of those, sometimes it gets really tricky and you end up having to do a lot of evaluation of, do you do it now? Do you do it a little later? Do you wait until a better time frame in order to kind of get it? Because some people may not want to do it for a variety of other reasons. So yeah, and then, the other diligence that we do is, do we want to change certain things around in terms of, the styling, the formatting, the substance? There's a variety, there's all kinds of different levers that you really want to be thinking about and wanting to try to utilize when you draft disclosure or you contemplate any change.
Jennifer?
Much of what's already been said really resonates with me, especially the point on stakeholder feedback. I'm also fortunate to sit in on many of our investor discussions, and I really enjoy hearing the feedback around governance and executive compensation practices. That can be a great source of information as you're thinking through your disclosure. The only other point I'd add is that I think it's important to get to the why. Why does something need to be changed? Is disclosure being enhanced just for the sake of making revisions, or is there something that's driving it? Is there a rule development, for example, an emerging practice? Have investors raised questions about particular topics? And thinking through all of that, as well as considering it within the framework, as Alex had mentioned, of what your company's appetite for new or evolving disclosure would be, is an important consideration.
You beat me to the punch. I just drafted a blog that will be coming out soon about the why of disclosure. It's definitely the question to ask. Thank you, Jennifer. Alex, you touched on design in your remarks a minute ago. How much do you think about design when you draft?
So I think it's a great question, and having been in the industry for a little bit of time, I've found a variety or a spectrum of people who have different philosophies on design, right? And how much they're willing to spend time on it, or how much they care about it, to be frank. So in my experience, there's some people who are really not wired that way, which is okay. But disclosure has come a long way from being the required and regulatory requirement, right? Where it looks like a book, you write out your passages of all your stuff, and it's now become a marketing piece. And the reason why it's so critical that you at least be mindful of and try to kind of reflect on how do you want to design stuff is there are thousands of these or hundreds of these that some of these, professionals are having to evaluate and use. And in order for them to make the right decisions and to make them quickly and easily, you have to help them in terms of making it such that it's easier for them to identify the key information, and that they get it right such that they make the best decision that they can that's most favorable to you. So I've worked in both a resource constrained situation where in my previous place, we didn't have all kinds of designers, right? We didn't have all kinds of people kind of helping us out. And I've worked now here at Intel where there's obviously a lot more resources. And there are pluses and minuses that I want to just share with everybody who's out there about being in both of them. If you're in a resource constrained environment, you have to be the Swiss Army knife, and that's a challenge, right? That you're having to kind of be that person who has to kind of think about this stuff. But you also have to realize you have autonomy. You also have the ability to efficiently effectuate change. The drawback, the other side, the flip side is if you're at a larger place, you may have all kinds of resources. You may have advisors, you may have other people who may help, but then it starts becoming more challenging because you've got now a lot more bureaucracy, a lot more parties, where you're having to align and make sure that they all agree on how you're going to approach some of this stuff. And some people may care and some people may not. So I say design is a critical thing. And the more time I have to deal with that subject, the more time I seem to kind of put into it, because I think it can be very, very useful. And, couple examples for us that we try to do is, we try to utilize concepts like, what do you do with your formatting, right? Like your bolding, to draw readers to keywords, to statements, your use of headings, making them punchy such that you may be able to effectively get the essence of what the next paragraph is going to tell you about just from reading the headline, pulling out key data into like call out boxes or putting them into certain places. Those are all things that we try to do. And you can look at a couple of years ago, we did a statement of opposition where basically if you just read our headlines, you literally got everything you needed. And we put out call out boxes on all the key stats. And I doubt anybody reads at the page 140, whatever it is, your detailed things. So I think that level of thought around design can be very helpful and useful if you weave it all the way through.
Yeah, I think that's a smart idea. But when you did say you have more parties at a resource intensive place, I kept thinking of Elaine and Seinfeld with the get well soon. We want you to get well. You have more get well parties.
That's
Jennifer,
good.
what about you on design?
I think design is really critical. I'll echo the point that increasingly SEC filings are not just compliance documents, but they're investor-facing communications, and they're intended to present a clear and compelling picture about a company, its mission, and its business initiatives. And the filings live on. They're used to inform voting and investment decisions. So you want to have your disclosure be accurate and compliant, of course, but also readable, transparent, and understandable. And design can help with that. I tend to rely on others in the design process, as well as a lot of the sample types of disclosure that we've been talking about. Either internal brand design can be very helpful, or external design firms like Labrador have tons of examples, and they're really knowledgeable and often spend hours looking at comparable companies' disclosure, and they can really help add value in thinking through how to present well-designed disclosure documents that are reflective of your company's brand.
Thank you. Enrique?
Yeah, I agree. I do think design is really important in the drafting phase, and I do think it contributes to transparency. So I think there are a few points that are important. First, you might have really great governance practices. You might have really great compensation practices, but you're not giving yourself credit for those because you are including that information in your proxy or your disclosures in a way that is hard to find. So really highlighting what you're doing and making that easy to find and easy to read can really go a long way. And I do think that proxies are also getting longer, disclosures are getting longer. So leveraging elements like summaries or executive summaries and charts and graphs that have an at a glance aspect to it. So say if your shareholder is only going to look at 10 pages of your document, you really need to be in front of what those 10 pages look like, so they really get the bulk of what you're trying to say by just taking that quick look on the executive summary or something like that. I completely agree, Alex. There's a range, but even small things you can do if you don't have all the resources, like using bold or charts and graphs that even a lawyer can put together, might go a long way. I do appreciate that law schools don't really teach design, so thankfully, because I would have been terrible at it. But if you are at a company that has a communications and marketing department, and if you have access to outside advisors like Labrador and other firms, you can really get a lot of good thinking and making your external facing message look consistent across. So we try to incorporate, again, with the limitations that we have in proxy world, but incorporate elements of our external design as a company into our disclosures. Are the colors matching? Are the shapes and layouts matching? So when the shareholder is getting those materials at home, they said, "Oh yeah, this is all coming from the same place." So that can be very compelling, and it can even be a shareholder engagement strategy. Some companies do charitable campaigns, and if retail voters vote their shares, they donate a certain amount to a charity. So even that can be a vector that you can explore as a shareholder engagement and making sure that people are reading. And finally, as Jennifer said, recruiting. I see a lot of times when we hire new executives, they read the proxy, they know what's said, they have it annotated, and that can be a really powerful tool in that respect as well.
So Jennifer, we started the conversation in this panel talking about planning. So when you are in charge of a disclosure team, what is your process to ensure that the people that you're relying on to deliver timely and competently?
Sure, great question, Brock. So I prefer to set clear timing and responsibilities at the outset of any drafting process. And I think it's critical to start early. So I like to use checklists that have clearly defined ownership lanes and deadlines. We also rely on preparer and reviewer sign-off charts. It's often important to have somebody preparing disclosure and then have another set of eyes to take a read through that. I think calendars can be very useful in contextualizing deadlines. That can help show not only when people need to deliver their own sections, but also get some buy-in into how people's individual sections or sections that they're reviewing fit in with a bigger picture of the various reviews and approvals that are needed. before disclosures actually get filed. I think staying in sync is so important too, not only with your legal team that might be working with you, but also with your broader stakeholder group. And working group meetings might be important. The exact cadence might vary for your company, but it could be a weekly meeting amongst the disclosure group to provide status updates, talk through questions, or convey reminders on deadlines.
Enrique?
Yeah, I don't know that I have too much to add. I'll just share a couple of anecdotes from my own experience. First, as Jennifer said, I think disclosure is a team sport. You really need to get your partners hand in hand with you, the folks from HR, investor relations, the corporate governance, legal team, and marketing, if you're getting them looped in. Really make sure that everyone's on the same page, understands that this is an enterprise work product. It's not just the legal department or just IR that are in charge of this, and everyone looks good if the work product looks good. So, and as Jennifer said, starting early is key. And I would just mention that to the extent that you're including new disclosures, get management buy-in as early as possible. You don't want to surprise your most senior executives or your board with a total redesign or a total refresh that they only see at the very last minute. You might get some allergic reaction to that. So making sure that when you're doing this project timeline that Jennifer talked about, really building in the time to sit down with your executives or your disclosure committee to really show them and explain, get them to sign off on this. And really having this culture of accountability with each other. So we do weekly check-ins on the proxy, for example, seeing how everyone's doing. Does anyone need help? Do you have the right resources to deliver on your part? Do we need to shift things around and do that in a dynamic way? But communication is key, and we really need to be synced up really well.
That's awesome. Alex, anything to add?
Yeah, I would say we do a lot of the same things that Jennifer and Enrique mentioned. I think the only other things that kind of just come to mind that I think are useful, spending time and taking effort to really engage with the individual functions that are involved, I think can be very helpful, providing them with a lot more of the context around what's the environment that you're going to be working in. What are the dynamics? What are some of the challenges that you foresee? Also trying to understand what they're doing too, because sometimes this is not, it's not a one-sided kind of, we put together a plan and we just force it down on everybody and everybody just follows along. You have to kind of work with people. So I would say getting that individualized maybe context and engagement, I think can be very helpful. It'll build rapport. It'll give you a much more informed and I think a better plan of action for everybody. And then also the other parties can then help create and draft better disclosure for you when they have all of that broader, better context, right, around the stuff. And the only other thing that we do, in addition to all the other stuff that has already been mentioned, is we'll do a kickoff meeting, which I'm sure most public companies do. And I find that that's a really great tool to just kind of get everybody started and on the same foot, and provide a little bit more of that broader context in a wider setting. And sometimes it's great that you will have all kinds of parties kind of talking in a group setting, because they'll bring out certain things where you're like, okay, if that person said it connects a dot for somebody else on something, and then that causes you to reshuffle what you had in mind in terms of your plan or how you're going to do disclosure. So group opportunities for you can be helpful as well.
Yeah, I definitely agree that groupthink, crowdsourcing, and you might hear things that you didn't, well, of course, that you might not have realized were going on, or maybe someone's going on vacation for a month and you were going to be heavily dependent on them for a particular role. So that's important to find out too. Enrique, any final disclosure tips to offer?
Well, read Brock's blog. It's really good. I think that's the best tip you can offer anyone in this space, but also, team culture, super important. Attention to detail, and making sure that everyone feels like they have ownership of the work product. So it's not just oh, the legal department is leading this, so they can figure it out. That's not a formula for success. So open communication, teamwork, and allowing people to voice their suggestions. You'd be amazed if you let your HR lead say, "What do you think we should do better or we should do different?" They'll have ideas, and they will be really good, and you should really listen to them. So you get a lot of wealth in your team, and you're not alone doing this. I think that's a important part, that again, it's a team sport. And as I said, give yourself a little bit of grace. You're not going to be able to achieve absolutely everything on your list every single year. There might be things that you will have to wait another year to be able to accomplish, to convince people, to get the right resources and process behind you to be able to deliver. So gradual improvement is great improvement as well. And keep folks informed, and have fun during the process, because it's really cool to see your work product in the end delivered. And when you see an executive coming in for an interview with your document in hands, you're like, yeah, this is good stuff. So you feel like you've accomplished something very nice. So give yourself credit and give your team credit for the good work in the end.
Yeah, I love the giving yourself grace. We're actually going through a workbook right now called Unmasking the Inner Critic, and we are our own biggest enemies. And it's no matter how old you get, trust me. Alex, any tips?
Yeah, I think that's a great one, Enrique. Find humor wherever you can, because it's otherwise, if you're not laughing, you're going to be crying. And I think it is a long-term game. I think that is really important. This isn't a one-time transactional undertaking. I think people really need to kind of think about that as being the culture around disclosure. It's not only consistent, but it's evolutionary, and it evolves and it keeps going. So, even if you can't do something in a particular year or a particular point in time, it's okay to kind of put it in the bucket of, you know what, this is going to be something that we're going to actually try to take on next year when we've got a little bit more time, or we have a little bit more knowledge, or there might be a little bit of a better receptive environment. And then the third thing that I would just point out is, don't think about effective disclosure necessarily about highlighting all of your good things. Think about it also as the opportunity to provide context necessarily for any places where you find humility, or you're like, I don't know if I feel good about this. But sharing the why and where you are on that journey, I think, is really, really important. I think your stakeholders, even if they disagree, let's say your investors, they will appreciate in terms of understanding the why. And then it'll help you when you go on your journey and you're trying to sell your messaging. It helps to kind of say, okay, well, this is why we had it before. And as you hopefully will improve, you have a story to tell, versus it kind of you wanting to hide the bad stuff. And then suddenly it pops up, you see all this wonderful stuff. Well, you haven't given them the journey. And I think you then don't get the opportunity to take the credit for all of that work. And I think building up that credibility with your stakeholders as you kind of deal with problems, I think will help you anytime you have a new problem that comes up where you don't have a magic solution, where you can kind of say, okay, here's what we're going to try to do. So that's my only other tidbit.
Yeah, great stuff. And these are also compliance documents as well as communication documents. Jennifer?
These are great tips. I'll add that staying connected with your key stakeholders during the drafting process and being open to feedback is really critical. The disclosure is a partnership. Disclosure is constantly evolving. And so connecting with your key stakeholders, being open to what is said, being open to hearing what is discussed during stakeholder engagement can be really valuable ways to continue evolving your disclosure.
Thank you so much. This was incredible. No prep calls. We just went live, and this has been awesome. So I can't thank you enough, Jennifer, Alex, and Enrique. Great job.
Thanks so much, Brock. Great to be here.
Likewise. Nice to meet everybody.